This time on Engine Masters, we're gonna show you how to buy the right cylinder heads. Meanwhile, we're gonna stumble into a killer combination for a 408 Ford stroker. This episode is going to be a deep dive on how to buy the right cylinder heads for your engine. And actually, the data here is being applied to a small block Ford, but really, it's kind of broad across any engine family because all we're dealing with here is airflow and the dynamics of the volume and the cross-sectional area of the intake port. And we're doing that specifically by testing 3 sets of Airflow Research Renegade cylinder heads. Now, one of them has a 165cc intake port, one of them is a 195cc, and one of them is a 220. Now, the common internet theory is that you can put too big of a head on your engine and therefore lose bottom end torque, and that's what we want to find out. And to do that, I've assembled an engine that is a really, really calm street going motor. I wanted to keep the airflow and the RPM down so that we could do the best job possible in finding out if too big of an intake port really does kill torque. The engine itself is a 410 cubic inch stroker that's based on a Ford 351 Windsor. The short block is from Blueprint Engines. You've seen it a bunch of times on Engine Masters. It's been really good to us. Up top, the Holley XP carburetor, an 850 double pumper. The intake manifold is an Edelbrock dual plane. Best thing for the street, best thing for torque. It's a Performer RPM air gap. We've put MSD ignition in it. The cam itself is really small. The duration at 50 thousandths tappet lift is 218 on the intake, 224 on the exhaust. Very low lift at half an inch, 0.513 inch lift, and it's on 110 degree lobe separation angle. The engine itself is about 10.2 to 1. The exhaust system is a set of open headers, Hooker Supercomps in a 1 3/4 inch tubing diameter. What we're gonna do with this is run those 3 sets of heads across it with different intake ports, and there's a few other features that they have that are different as well, and I'll spell that out later. But we're gonna start out with the tamest cylinder head that Airflow Research makes for the small block Ford. It has a 165cc intake port, and it's the most affordable one that they make. I'm really concerned that it's just gonna choke the power out of a big 410 cubic inch small block, but you never know until you go strap it on the dyno, which is what we're about to do. We've run this thing in the dyno in a bunch of different configurations, but the one thing that stayed the same is we've always used the Amsoil Dominator 1030 in this thing. And there's a chance this thing is actually gonna squeak its way into one of my own cars, and I always use synthetics in the stuff that I really care about, obviously not in some of the clapped out junk that I drive. So this thing will survive on Amsoil, and you know I really care about it because look, I brought a funnel so as not to soil my new AFR valve covers. Yeah, this is the single smallest camshaft I've ever intentionally installed.
So you're turning into me, you're turning into a top of the page guy instead of a bottom of the page guy.
Yeah, smooth idle, nice drivability. I still think these cylinder heads are gonna strangle it with that 165cc intake port.
I agree.
I gotta tell you, I got a chance to look at this thing, you know, before you guys got here when I was getting it up, and this thing's pretty good. I kind of have a new favorite combination: big motors, small heads, small cams. So
it's heresy.
I want the small cam and the gigantic heads.
Yeah,
that's
well,
going to be the
see.
magic.
That's ridiculous!
in your face.
What?
That's what I was saying. I'm looking at the curve when I pre-ran it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh wow, would this be fun? I mean, this thing's got 450 pound-feet at 2,500 RPM.
And what was the peak? 520? Let's look
yeah,
at
as far
it.
as torque, it's really bad.
I was just blown away by the torque curve on this thing. Look at that. We just made 515 pound-feet of torque and 471.4 horsepower. I didn't see that coming either.
I know, that's what I said
The
was so good about
471?
it. Because it's kind of as good power-wise as a good 383 stroke or something, but they don't make this kind of torque.
They don't make 500
and they
pound-feet.
certainly don't have that kind of drivability.
Yeah.
Now you guys know why I bleed Ford blue, right?
Are we only going to ruin it from here?
Well, if we take away from here and add to there, then it's kind of driver's decision. But as long as we can hold on to this and pick up some of this, then that's going to be a win.
Can I go out on a limb here?
I'm sure you will anyway.
I really don't think that the intake port cross-section is going to affect that very much.
But the
size
increased
of it.
airflow has got to make it better.
Here's the question though. What does it do at part throttle? We're going to look at full throttle, but what's it do at part throttle with a big head versus this thing? This 165.
Yeah, we don't know. Okay, the reason that was mind-blowing is that none of us expected a 410 cubic inch engine to be able to make that kind of horsepower and torque through a 165cc intake port. That is considered very small. Typically, you'd think of that cylinder head for like a 302 cubic inch engine, but I think what that trained us is that that number alone is not everything when you're buying a cylinder head, even though it's normally how people refer to heads. For example, these would be an AFR 165, 195, and 220. That's the lingo that people throw out, but there's more to it. Let me explain to you what that CC number really means, and I'm gonna do that using this cutaway of a Mopar 426 Hemi cylinder head. This is actually a Keith Black head that was given to me a long time ago, but it's super handy for showing stuff like this. So imagine you've got your intake valve right here and your exhaust is over here. This is your intake port, that's your exhaust port. Now, if there was a valve in here sealing it off, and if you were to fill it with water up to this face right here, which is where the intake manifold bolts on, then you could measure that volume of water in cc's and it would tell you the overall volume of the port. That's where those numbers come from. But there's another thing that you need to know. It's called minimum cross-sectional area. It's the smallest point inside the intake port, and it's another number that people use to sort of evaluate if a cylinder head is in the range of what they want to use or not, and that would be right here on this cylinder head. So that changes on the AFR heads as well. For example, the 165cc has a pinch or smallest cross-sectional area of 1.935 inches. Then you move on to your 195, and it's got a 2.075 pinch, and on the biggest head, it's actually 2.375. So you can see that the size varies a lot, and the theory is that the bigger the port is, the more you can tend to lose low RPM torque, and that's what we're gonna find out today. But let me tell you what's the same about the three cylinder heads that we're gonna test before I tell you about what's different about them. First of all, they're all from Airflow Research. They're all from the Renegade line. They're all CNC ported and they all have a 58cc chamber on them. So the compression ratio on all of these is the same. The other thing that's important to note is that the rocker arm studs are in the same place on all of these, so you can interchange them without having to worry about rocker arm geometry and push rod length and stuff like that. Now here's some things that are different about these cylinder heads. The valve size is one of them. On the 165 head, you have a 1.94 inch intake valve and a 1.6 in the exhaust. The 195 head that we're just about to bolt on has a larger 2.05 intake valve and a 1.6 on the exhaust. And the 220 head, which by the way, this isn't one of them, this is just a prop, but the 220 has a 2.1 inch intake valve, and because that's so big, they had to reduce the size of the exhaust valve to 1.57. Another thing that is different between the various heads is going to be the exhaust port. They know as the head sort of gets racier and racier that you need more flow not just on the intake side but also on the exhaust. And for that reason, the exhaust port is 68 cc's on the 165 and it's 70 on the other two. But the other modification is that the exhaust on the 195 and the 220 is raised, which tends to improve flow. On the 195cc head, it's raised 0.125 inches, 1/8 of an inch. On the 220, it's raised 0.375, 3/8 of an inch. Now that can be important to you if you're buying headers because sometimes they won't fit if the ports have been changed, and you can see that on the two bigger cylinder heads, the exhaust pattern is what they call double drilled. There's a wider pattern and a narrower pattern, and especially on the 220, it's possible to put a header on it that can block a little bit of that exhaust port flow. So what we're doing here is not just scientifically testing the intake port design alone. Instead, we're gonna test what you can realistically buy off the shelf from any manufacturer for any domestic V8 engine that you might have. Because this technology, it all applies to anything, a Chevy, a Mopar, whatever. And we're gonna do the best to sort of bench race that out and get some solid data when we go to the dyno and remove the 165 to install the 195cc head as our next step. And finally, we're gonna wrap it up with the AFR 220 and find out if, like the internet says, too big of a head can kill torque.
I've got a really simple theory when it comes to heads, port size, and velocity and all that.
Bigger is better?
Oh man, you just totally stole my thunder. How did you know?
I've met you.
I think here's a good tech note. Because on some of the gasket manufacturers you'll see on the Ford gasket where it says front,
Yeah?
this one actually doesn't. So you need to be smart enough to know why. In both the cylinder head and the block, there are water passages. It's the head gasket that determines the direction of flow. So if we were to have put this gasket on this way,
Yeah.
the water is going to enter the water pump, come through the cylinder head, come right out here into the intake manifold and back out the front. This whole part of the motor would have zero flow.
I did not know. That's
so
good.
now we do this,
And all the
and
water
the
goes
water
to
is
the back.
forced all the way to the back, comes up the back, through the head, out the water passage, so it circulates and flows and cools the whole block.
Also, did you notice this is a Mr. Gasket MLS?
I did.
Their claim is that the coating on this does not require as smooth a surface as some of the other ones.
Oh, interesting, because yeah, a lot of them, it gives you a specific RA finish that you have to
Yep.
use the gasket.
They say it can be a little bit rougher.
Just so you know, that's my one and only Ford tech tip
It was really good.
for the year.
I liked it.
I only have two. I'll save one for next year.
195 cylinder heads going on. Here comes a winner. You know what else is really cool about the AFR heads?
What?
8mm valve stem.
Oh, that's really good.
Yep. Kills some weight, flows better.
Yeah.
Good. I'm confident it makes more power everywhere.
That would be cool if it did, because it made really good power before. We have a pretty big step to go up.
It flows a lot more.
But the valve diameter is good on this head. I like that.
Will it make 500 horsepower? We're gonna pick up 30 numbers.
No.
I don't think so either.
Well, blurt out a number, Steve-O. Come on.
93.
93.
493
Yeah.
horsepower.
Well, we were at 470, right?
Yeah.
500.
Dulcich called it. I can't naysay it, because he's Dulcich.
I know.
Man,
the
come
wizard
on,
of all
baby.
wizards.
Not quite there, but still really impressive.
I had a pretty good feeling when it came in about 8 pound-feet better.
Yeah.
So at this point, with this cam, so far, this is a better cylinder head.
Absolutely. The bigger cylinder head makes more power. Kind of no shock whatsoever. Really, at every single point in the curve. This stuff down here is like 2,600 and below, and it's the same down there. So we made 520.8 pound-feet of torque, 484 horsepower, with a really broad spread. Almost 1,800 RPM between the RPM at peak torque and peak horsepower, which makes for a really nice engine.
You know, I don't think the big surprise is the 195. I think the big surprise is how good
The 165
is. It's amazing.
It still blows my mind. I'm really shocked by it. The thing we don't know is like throttle response, transitional throttle, part throttle. You know, we know the airspeed has got to be faster through the 165 head, and we know that that leads to better tipping.
I know with the 165 it would be really good.
What?
The part throttle, transitional throttle response, all that stuff, it would be really good.
Yeah.
And on this big of an engine, even the 195, it's got to be excellent.
It's got to be.
But now
No
is the
downside.
220 going to finally lose some torque, or are we going to see the same torque and even more power?
I say same torque and
why
more
we're
power.
here. I think every internet forum on Earth claims this is going to be worse, killing torque, right?
Really?
Yeah, I think
Right.
they do.
I don't read the internet enough, apparently.
It would
No,
be
it's-
consensus.
yeah.
Consensus would be it's too big.
Yeah, too big of a port.
It's just like
Yeah.
Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The other heads are probably just right,
Yeah, probably.
but probably not. I'd say Papa Bear is the best.
The fail in our test here is I think I chose a 410 cubic inch engine because
Had you chosen a 302 and started with a 165 and found out that a 220 might be too big at some point?
I tried to compensate for that with the small camshaft, you know.
And then you just made more torque.
All I did is make more torque. How are we going to live with ourselves if it actually makes more power everywhere? And
I think
people
it
tell
will.
us we're wrong.
I think it will. I really do.
I think it will too. But it might give up a little bit of
Might
torque.
give up 5 or 6, between 2,500 and 3 is my guess, and then it's off to the races.
And it's going to make 497 horsepower.
493.
493.
I don't want to make a guess this time.
I'm going to guess because it doesn't matter. You're always right and I'm always wrong.
I'm just going to be silent on this one.
Okay. Well, let's find out what it is going to do.
It's the same as the 165.
Yeah.
After all of that, I'm not sure we really proved anything.
It proved I don't know anything.
I know, I don't know anything either. I mean, I think that 165 is a killer head. I think we proved the 195 is the logical one you really should run on an engine like this, even if you've got another 20 degrees of cam probably. And if it's anything bigger than that, you want the 220 with the correct single plane intake manifold and the correct solid roller cam and the correct big header.
And making peak power at 7,500 RPM
Right.
and all of those things that head is designed for with that kind of flow number at 800 lift.
But this is the craziest thing, that these numbers we have on the screen right now, those are the 165 head versus the 220. They essentially run exactly the same. So my walk away is throw the 195s back on this thing and stab it in Mach 1 and have a great time. Ready to go wrap this up and like try and package all this information into a believable ball of BS.
Oh, no.
Believable or unbelievable, the numbers are the numbers. They're just a little confusing even, you know.
I've got it all put in a box, man. I get it completely.
Well, go spill. Let's do it. Okay, Steve, open up your big box of wisdom.
Well, I've got to admit, I mean, the 408 Ford took me to school.
Really? How?
Yeah, my whole theory of bigger is always better kind of let me down for the first time.
So what's the point, Dulcich?
Well, the point as far as I'm concerned is we didn't lose any low-end torque, and that's really what people talk about with bigger heads. We made great power with a tiny head on a big cubic inch motor with a tiny camshaft. So I guess really there is no conclusion.
Well, no, there is because of what you're talking about. I think that we are starting to see stuff that we've never tested before where a good cylinder head with a tiny camshaft is a great street motor. And that's probably something a lot of people have known for a long time, but we're just discovering it because normally we like giant cam stuff. But the whole thing about proving that a large port kills low-end torque, we didn't see that at all. But to be fair, on the dyno, it's not really showing throttle transitions and things like that. So I'm not sure that people can conclude categorically that you should always put the biggest cylinder head that you can on your engine. I don't think that's the case. I think the 195 is the right cylinder head for this combination.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say the 195 seemed to be the optimum. It did make the most horsepower, and it's probably the right head for this motor.
So you were gonna open your big box of wisdom and I just ripped it open like a 5-year-old on Christmas morning?
Well, I've already shared with you all the conclusions.
Oh, that's right. I just sapped your knowledge and shared it with the audience as if it was mine. And that's what happens pretty much on every episode of Engine Masters. We'll see you next time.
This is not a man bun, is it?
Well, not yet.
No, it never will be.
If you move it just an inch higher, you're getting close to a man bun. But see, it's a ponytail now.